The laughter echoed across the airport terminal, sharp and unkind, bouncing off polished floors and high glass ceilings. "Hey, look at this guy," one of them snorted, a man in a tight designer polo shirt, pointing with mockery toward an old man sitting quietly near gate 14. "Halloween came early, huh? Gramps, who wears that kind of uniform in public?" The group burst into more laughter, loud enough to turn heads. But the man they mocked didn't flinch. He sat still, hands folded neatly in his lap, eyes staring into the distance, with a calm only time and war could teach. His name was Thomas Hale, a 76-year-old retired U.S. Army Master Sergeant. He wore his olive green service uniform, creased to perfection, medals pinned on his chest, cap resting softly on his knee. He didn't wear it for attention. He wore it because today mattered. One of the younger men in the group, maybe late 20s, cocked his head. "Yo, he's got medals," he said, smirking, but like the cosplay kind. "Amazon Prime special, more laughter. Bet he tells kids he stormed Normandy. Looks like he can barely storm the restroom." Thomas blinked slowly. "Excuse me," said a voice. This one softer. A young woman, early 30s, standing just a few feet away. She wore a red Delta Airlines uniform. Her name tag read Sarah Bloom, gentleman. "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voices. You're disturbing other passengers." One of the men, the one with the watch that screamed new money, rolled his eyes. "Relax, lady. We're just joking around. What's the old man gonna do? Salute us into submission? He earned the right to wear that uniform," Sarah said sharply. "Unlike you, who haven't earned the right to laugh." Thomas finally turned. His voice was quiet, but each word carried weight. "It's all right," Missy said. "Let them laugh. I didn't wear this for them." Sarah's eyes softened. "May I ask, sir, why today?" Thomas looked down at the watch on his weathered wrist. 50 years ago today, I lost 11 men in a valley. No one remembers. I wear this so they're not forgotten." The laughter died instantly. The air around gate 14 went still. The group of mockers looked at each other, suddenly unsure, suddenly smaller. But one of them, the youngest, stepped forward. "Wait, what valley?" Thomas didn't look at him. He didn't need to. "Ashkai Valley, 1975. Afghanistan." "No way," the young man said. You were there." Thomas nodded once. "And I came home alone." Sarah knelt down next to him. "Sir, are you Thomas Hale? Master Sergeant Thomas Hale?" He looked at her, puzzled. "Yes." Her eyes widened. "The Medal of Honor recipient. My father used to talk about you. He read your story to me when I was little. You dragged 4 of your men out under enemy fire. They said it was impossible." "It was," he said simply, "but I did it anyway." One of the older mockers, the ringleader, turned pale. "Wait, are you serious?" "The guy from the documentary." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "They made a film about it." Sarah smiled through a tear. "A documentary. It won the Peabody. You saved your whole unit. They said your commanding officer cried when he pinned the medal on you." Thomas chuckled. The sound, low and warm. "He did. And he never cried. Not even when he lost a leg in Nam." The group of men had gone silent now. Truly silent. The younger one stepped forward again. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know. You didn't care to know." Sarah snapped. "You saw an old man in uniform and decided he was a joke." Thomas waved a hand gently. "No need. They're not the first. Won't be the last." One of the men, the one with the expensive shoes, looked down at his feet. "Can I shake your hand, sir?" Thomas looked at him. Eyes, clear, piercing even now. "Why?" The man paused. "Because I judged you without knowing who you were, and, because you earned it." Thomas stood slowly. His knees ached, but his back remained straight. He extended his hand. The man took it, squeezing awkwardly. "Thank you for your service." Thomas gave a curt nod. "Don't thank me. Remember the men who didn't come home?" Sarah looked around. Dozens of people had stopped to watch. Cameras were being lowered, not raised. Not a single soul had filmed it. Somehow, they all understood this wasn't for views. It was for reverence. A boy, maybe 7, tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, is he a hero?" The mother knelt beside him. "Yes, Shunny, he is. The intercom crackled. Final boarding for Flight 295 to Washington, D.C. All passengers, please proceed to Gate 14. Sarah turned to Thomas. Sir. Do you need assistance boarding? He shook his head. I've walked through minefields. I think I can handle a jet bridge. She smiled. Of course, sir. As Thomas turned to walk toward the gate, Sarah touched his arm. What are you going to do in D.C.? He stopped, looked back. Arlington. I have 11 names to visit. The hush returned. The mockers stood in shameful silence as he walked past them. But Thomas didn't carry bitterness. Only the weight of memory. Only the pride of duty. One of them, the youngest again, broke the silence. What's it like? He asked. To be a hero? Thomas didn't stop walking. He just said over his shoulder, there's no such thing as a hero, just people who didn't run. The gate closed behind him. Sarah stood for a long time after he disappeared from view, and the men who mocked him, they never forgot that day. Not because they were humiliated, but because they saw what real honor looked like and realized they'd laughed at it. They say shame is a powerful teacher, but reverence, that's what changes a man. Thomas took his seat in 12A, window seat. As always, he liked to look out, not at the sky, but past it, beyond it, as the engines hummed to life. He rested his head against the cool glass and closed his eyes. It was April 18.1975. Again, he could smell the gunpowder, the blood, the wet metal of his own rifle. He could feel the vibration of the chopper blades above them. But there was no chopper now, just wind, just screaming. Sergeant Hale, Private Lenny Russo shouted over the chaos. They're everywhere. There, get down. The explosion lifted half the dirt from the valley floor. Hale's ears rang, his vision smeared with smoke and blood. Lenny's body was 10 feet away now, half a body. Hale crawled, ribs screaming, pulled Lenny's dog tags from what was left of his uniform. 1 down, 10 to go. Command, this is Bravo 999. We are pinned. Repeat pinned. We need evac ASAP. Static. Then a voice. Bravo 9, I evac denied. Airspace is red, too hot. Then we'll die out here, Hale bellowed. He grabbed his pack. Bullets slicing the air around him. He could barely hear Private Mason sobbing behind a boulder. His arm dangling, shredded to ribbons. Hale sprinted through fire, dragged Mason across the rocks, wrapped the wound with torn cloth. He didn't sleep for 72 hours. He didn't blink during those 3 days. Not until he pulled out the last living man and was hit in the leg doing it. The bullet had gone straight through. A clean hole. No exit wound, just pain. When the medevac finally came, he carried Corporal Jennings over his shoulder while limping. The helicopter pilot had screamed, "Where the hell are the rest?" "They're gone," Thomas had said. "All gone. Back on the plane." Thomas opened his eyes slowly. A tear had formed without permission. He wiped it away before the flight attendant walked by. "Would you like anything to drink, sir?" He looked at her. She was young, soft-spoken. His granddaughter would have been that age. "Coffee," he said. "Black." And maybe a little silence. She blinked, startled, but then gave a small nod. "Of course, sir." Thomas pulled out a photograph from his inside pocket. It was old, corners worn, but it held the faces of 11 men, some smiling, some cocky, some just boys. He ran his fingers across their faces. "Still here," he whispered, "still carrying you." When the plane landed at Ronald Reagan Airport, a military escort waited at the gate. An Army lieutenant stood at attention, saluting the moment Thomas stepped off. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "That really necessary, son?" The lieutenant swallowed. "It's an honor, sir. Command sent me to accompany you to Arlington." Thomas waved him off. "I've walked this path before. I'll walk it again." "But, sir..." "Walk with me if you want," Thomas said. "But don't carry me like a ghost." The young officer fell silent and nodded. They rode in a government vehicle, silence heavy between them. When they reached the gates of Arlington, Thomas gripped the armrest. "You ever been here before?" "Lieutenant, once. Funeral detail for a sergeant first class. Iraq War. You remember his name?" The lieutenant looked ashamed. "No, sir." Thomas stared out the window. "Then you didn't really come." They parked near Section 60. Thomas stepped out slowly, his knees catching fire with every movement. The lieutenant reached to help. Thomas batted him away. Save it for someone who needs it. He hobbled forward, every step measured, deliberate. He stopped at grave 37, 1092. Private Leonard Russo, he read aloud, age 19, Jersey boy. Couldn't shoot straight to save his life, but died trying. He knelt, grunting with pain, took out a small American flag and planted it. Still can't believe you beat me at poker that night. Lenny, he whispered, rig the damn cards. He stood, limped 5 feet over. Corporal Jennings, smartass, thought he knew everything about women. Didn't know a damn thing. He moved again. And again. 11 stops in total. At the last one, he sat on the grass. Breathing hard, Sergeant Peter Reyes, he said, you were the only one older than me. Married twice. Said war was easier than marriage. He looked around at the silent field of stone. Hope you all found peace. Because I haven't. A silence settled that was not of the earth. It came from inside, the silence that only warriors know. The lieutenant stood a respectful distance behind. Thomas turned back, raising his voice just enough. What's your name, soldier? Lieutenant Mark Caldwell, sir. You seen war yet? No, sir. Pray you don't. But if you do, never forget the ones who don't come back. Yes, sir. Thomas stood again. It took time. He looked toward the horizon, sunlight brushing over the marble headstones. Suddenly, the click of a camera shutter. A young woman, no older than 20, had stepped forward. She had seen him earlier at the airport, recognized him. Her name was Lila Monroe, a freelance journalist. She lowered her camera quickly. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to intrude. Thomas waved a hand. You can take your photo. Just don't write about me. Write about them. Lila's voice trembled. May I ask what happened to them? Thomas looked at the 11 headstones. They died so I could answer that question. And then he walked away, back at his hotel that evening. Thomas removed his jacket and shirt, revealing scars the public never sees. A line across his rib cage, a puncture near his collarbone, burn marks on his shoulder. He sat at the desk, opened a leather-bound notebook. He began writing, April 18th, Ashkai Valley. I don't write this to relive it. I write it so that when I'm gone, someone remembers. Thomas wrote for hours. The scratch of his pen, the only sound in the quiet hotel room. He didn't write like a man trying to remember. He wrote like a man trying not to forget. Names, dates, the weight of the rucksack, the smell of burning nylon. He wrote about Jennings' final words, about Lenny's fear, about the way silence fell after the last gunshot, the kind of silence that followed you home and crawled into your bed at night. The knock on the hotel door startled him. He looked at the clock. 10:16 p.m. He opened the door cautiously, half expecting no one to be there, but it was Sarah, the gate agent from earlier, holding a bag of takeout and looking nervous. I hope this isn't inappropriate, she said. I asked the flight manifest where you were staying. I didn't want to leave things like that. Thomas stepped aside without a word, gesturing her in. I brought soup, she added awkwardly, setting the bag on the table. My dad said, you always liked soup. He met you once, in Texas, Fort Hood. You probably don't remember. I remember your father, Thomas said, surprising her. Corporal Bloom, lost a toe in a training accident. Wrote poetry when he thought no one was looking. Her eyes welled instantly. You really remember him. I don't forget men like that, Thomas said quietly. The ones who didn't need war to be warriors. She sat across from him as he unwrapped the soup. Chicken and rice, still hot. Why did you really come? He asked. She hesitated. Because people like me owe you more than a quiet thank you in an airport. He shook his head. You owe me nothing. I owe you understanding, she said. We all do. He took a spoonful, chewing slowly. Most people think of war as something that happens elsewhere, he said. But it doesn't. It happens inside people. It takes root. Some men bring home wounds you can see. The others, we just bleed where you can't. She nodded. Do you hate them? The men who mocked you? Thomas shrugged. No, they weren't mocking me. They were mocking what they don't understand. And People fear what they don't understand. They lash out. She leaned forward. Then help them understand. Let me write your story. Publish it. He gave a tired smile. My story isn't unique. I'm just one man who lived. The interesting stories belong to the ones who didn't. But people will listen to you. Mr. Hale. He put the spoon down. I watched a man die with a grenade in his hand because he refused to drop it and risk blowing up the rest of us. I saw another carry his best friend's body 3 miles through enemy territory just to bury him properly. You think that kind of love happens in war? No, it happens in life. But war reveals it. It shows you who people really are. Sarah was silent. Thomas reached for a second photo. This one was black and white, a younger him, bloodied and dazed, being lifted onto a helicopter. They gave me a medal for surviving, he said. Not for being brave, not for being right, just for not dying when so many others did. You saved lives. I lost more. Silence stretched. I'm writing a book, he finally said. For them, not for me. She smiled. May I read it someday? If I finish before I die, he said, half joking. Do you need help? He looked up at her, studying her face. You really want to know? He asked. Then come with me tomorrow. There's someone I want you to meet. The next morning, they drove 2 hours out of D.C. to a small retirement home tucked into the hills of Virginia. The air was crisp. The buildings smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old books. Inside, a man sat by the window in a wheelchair, staring at the trees. He wore no medals, no uniform, just a plain gray sweater and thick glasses. This, Thomas said, is Captain Douglas Vance, my commanding officer. Saved my life. Vance turned slowly, eyes squinting. Is that you, Tommy? It is, sir. You look old. You too. They laughed. Sarah watched, moved. Captain, Thomas said, this is Sarah Bloom. She wants to write down what happened. Vance chuckled. You writing the whole damn tragedy. I want people to understand, Sarah said. The old captain leaned back. Then tell them what we saw. Tell them how we held the line at Ashkai Valley with a quarter of the men we were promised, with half the ammo, and no goddamn food. Tell them how we used our own jackets to tie tourniquets, how we carried each other when legs gave out. Tell them how we believed we wouldn't die, even when we were already dead inside. Sarah's hands trembled as she jotted notes. Tommy, Vance said, his voice softer now. I read about the airport. I didn't say anything, Thomas replied. You didn't have to. It was all over the news. Someone filmed a piece after you left, went viral. The guy you shook hands with, he posted an apology online, called you a saint. Thomas rolled his eyes. I'm no saint. Maybe not, Vance said, but you remind people what decency looks like. Sarah stood. Thank you, Captain. I'll make sure people know. Vance gave her a tired look. Don't write for glory, young lady. Write so that pain isn't wasted. That's the only justice we get. Back at the hotel, Thomas sat at the desk again, but this time, he didn't write alone. Sarah typed while he spoke. She asked questions, deep ones, not about guns or battles, but about the people. Why did you keep fighting even after losing so many? She asked once. He replied, because if I stopped, I'd become one of them. Not dead, just lost. Do you ever dream of them? Every night. And I let them come. I don't push them away. Each day they worked. Each night she read him passages back. His eyes would water, not from grief, but from gratitude, that someone cared enough to preserve what he never had the strength to. By the end of the week, they had a manuscript. She titled it, Ashkai, The Valley We Never Left. A month later, the manuscript was published digitally under a Creative Commons license. No agent, no PR campaign, no marketing team. Just Sarah's blog, a quiet upload, and a caption for those who never made it home. For those who did, but carried ghosts with them. Within hours, veterans began sharing it. Within days, it had over 1 million reads. Within weeks, schools began emailing Sarah for permission to use excerpts in their history classes. Thomas didn't own a smartphone. He didn't check comments. He didn't care for online numbers. But when Sarah knocked on his door again, 2 months later, holding an envelope with the seal of the United States Department of Defense, he knew it wasn't ordinary. She smiled. They're doing something, Tom. They're honoring the men of Ashkai. He raised an eyebrow. How? Public ceremony. Full military honors. Families of the fallen. Live streamed. All of it. And she hesitated, her eyes glowing. They're naming the new VA facility in Virginia after you. He looked away. I didn't write the book to get my name on a wall. You didn't. But the world needed a reminder, and you gave them one. July 4th, the sun rose over Arlington, crisp and golden, illuminating the white stones like an ocean of memory. A stage had been built near Section 60. Rows of folding chairs stretched into the grass. A banner overhead read, "In honor of bravery unseen, the men of ASHKI Valley." Sarah stood by the podium, clutching her speech. She wasn't a natural public speaker. Her hands trembled, but she held firm. Thomas stood near the back, in full uniform. His jacket was tighter now, but he still wore it like a second skin. His medals glinted under the sun. As families arrived, some brought framed photos, others brought flowers. Children clung to their mothers' hands, asking questions too big for their age. One woman, gray-haired, gentle, approached Thomas. "You're Sergeant Hale, aren't you?" "I was," he replied. "Now I'm just Thomas," she smiled. "My husband was Peter Reyes. You brought him home." Thomas inhaled slowly. "He deserved better than a body bag. You gave me a grave to visit. That's more than most widows get." She reached up and hugged him. "Thank you for giving me back a piece of him." He said nothing, just stood still as she wept into his shoulder. The ceremony began. A general stepped forward. His voice was loud, practiced, but full of reverence. "Today, we remember the men who stood in Ashkai Valley, who held a line the world forgot, under conditions no soldier should endure. And we honor the man who carried their story when no one else did, Master Sergeant Thomas Hale." Applause. But Thomas didn't move. Sarah nudged him gently. "They want you to speak." "I speak better through a pen," he grumbled. She smiled. "Then speak from the heart, like you did with me." He stepped forward, slow, every joint protesting, every step an act of quiet defiance against age. He stood at the podium, adjusted the mic, looked over the crowd. "I was told once, there's no such thing as heroes, only people who didn't run. I believed that for a long time, until I watched men run toward danger, toward death, not for medals, not for glory, but for each other." The wind stirred. "I wear this uniform, not because it makes me proud, but because it reminds me of the price they paid. Every stitch, every medal, every wrinkle is a name I still carry." He pulled out the faded photograph, held it up. "These are my brothers, not by blood, but by something deeper, something only war can forge. I live for them. I speak for them, and when I die, I want no headlines, just this picture and their names." The crowd stood in silence. No claps, just silence, the most sacred kind. And in the crowd, the group of young men from the airport stood near the back. Yes, them, the ones who laughed, the ones who posted that apology. They wore jackets now, no loud logos, no mocking smiles, just respect. One of them held a small plaque. After the ceremony, they approached Thomas. "We wanted to say this in person," the youngest said. "We were wrong. And we've spent the last 2 months raising funds to donate to a veteran support foundation in honor of the men you served with." He handed Thomas the plaque. It read, "To those who carried more than their weight and never asked for thanks." Thomas touched the engraving. "You changed," he said softly. They nodded. "Because of you." "No," he said, "because you chose to listen." That night, Thomas returned to the hotel. He didn't turn on the TV. He didn't scroll any social media. He opened his notebook and wrote 4 words. They remembered them today. Then he closed the book and slept. For the first time in years, truly slept. No gunfire, no screaming, just peace. 3 months later, Thomas Hale passed away in his sleep. No pain, no hospital, just stillness. A note was found on his nightstand, addressed to Sarah. Tell their stories when mine ends, because mine was never the one that mattered. Thank you for listening. At his funeral, thousands attended. Veterans.families.students.strangers. The Medal of Honor was placed atop his casket, but beside it rested a photo. 11 young faces, still smiling, still remembered, because the world finally saw the man they mocked for who he really was, and in doing so, they saw the men he carried and honored the silence they left behind.